The Mission, He Taught Me to Hope, Christmas Vignette, Darcy and the Young Knight's Quest, Book 2. Written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Part 1. A month had passed since young Bennet Carlton had learnt to think of Pemberley as his home, the chestnut pony in the large stable as his pony, the room that housed the four-poster bed, spacious enough for an army of knights, as his room, and the man who tucked him in bed each night as his father, forever his, as Darcy reminded him each night. Whatever time Ben spent outside the company of his mother, his Aunt Georgiana, and his newfound friend Samuel Reynolds, the housekeeper's grandson, he spent with his Da. On one such day, Ben arrived in Darcy's study a little earlier than he had been expected, eager to commence his morning riding lesson. Ben languished about the room, waiting for Darcy to finish his estate business and accompany him to the stables. His attention was garnered by several miniatures suspended over the mantelpiece. Ben studied the pictures with intent. He thought he might recognize the likeness of at least one amongst the collection. Try as he might, he did not. With the exception of minor dissimilarities, they all bore a resemblance to his Da. "Who are these people?" Darcy came forward and pointed to the picture farthest to his right. "This is a picture of me when I was younger." He noticed the subtle changes in his appearance with time. He cleared his throat. "Much younger." Pointing out another miniature, he said, "This ridiculous-looking character is Cousin Richard. Merlin to you." "Who is this?" "George Wickham." "Have I met him?" "Heaven forbid, God willing you never shall." "No, trust me, you have suffered no great loss." Ben looked up at Darcy with that same questioning look that his mother was wont to bestow. "Is he our friend?" "Why do you ask?" "Why else would you keep his picture on display? The picture is easily replaced, is it not?" "I imagine I leave it in place for sentimental reasons." "So you considered him a friend once, and thus the sentiments?" Something along those lines, I suppose." Truth be told, Darcy no longer cared for the man, for he had proven himself to be quite a scoundrel in the latter years. "I know Wickham's likeness was one of my father's favourites, but I should speak with Mrs. Reynolds about removing this picture." The last Darcy had heard of Wickham, he had joined the army. Imagine George Wickham, a lieutenant. Darcy nearly laughed aloud at the irony of it all. "This reminds me of a matter I wish to discuss with you." When Darcy failed to reply, Ben tugged Darcy's shirt sleeve. "Da?" "Yes, Ben?" "Samuel says he will be away from Pemberley soon." "Yes. I understand he spends half his time at Pemberley with his late father's parents. The balance of his time he spends with his late mother's parents. I am certain he will miss you as much as you will miss him, but he returns in the spring." "Yes, he does. I had hoped he would be here to spend Christmas with us. I have never had a friend my own age before now." "I understand. Some of my fondest memories of Christmas involve my cousin." "Will you share some of your memories with me? I enjoy so few memories of Christmas time. I should like very much to hear yours." "My earliest memories of Christmas, you say? Where do I begin?" Darcy gathered Ben into his arms and carried him to the sofa to have a seat in his lap. "As long ago as I can recall, my family journeyed to Matlock, to my mother's father's home for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, Richard and I often helped decorate the halls with garlands before venturing out with my father and uncle to cut the Yule log. We stayed up late and took part in festivities, listening to my grandfather spin tales whilst enjoying the fruits of our labour, as the burning Yule log provided a big crackling fire. Christmas Day mornings would find us wandering the halls, singing carols to guests and servants alike. Darcy smiled in remembrance of their antics. Later in the day, after church, we were permitted to join our elders for a splendid Christmas dinner. But that was some years ago. After my grandparents passed away, Christmas time was no longer spent in Matlock. My uncle tended to frown upon the whole occasion.
My Bennet grandparents are still alive, and yet I hardly recollect having ever enjoyed Christmas at Longbourn.
Have you any fond memories of Camberwell?
I suppose I do, although I do not recall. My mamma often reminds me that Grandfather Carlton particularly enjoyed the season. If I recall anything of my past Christmases at Camberwell, it is feelings of sadness.
Ben's face became wistful, reflecting his attempt to gather the wisps of memories.
I believe I must have suffered my grandfather's absence.
I imagine you did indeed. Even though I was a bit older than you when Grandfather and Grandmother Fitzwilliam passed away, I always suffer their absence, especially at Christmas time. Ben placed his small hand on Darcy's cheek.
Do you miss your parents at Christmas time as well?
Indeed I do. The drawn, faraway look in Darcy's eyes concerned young Ben.
I am sorry, Dar.
What have you to be sorry about?
I did not intend to make you sad.
You did not. My memories of my parents are all happy ones.
I do not believe I will be as sad as I was last Christmas ever again.
Last Christmas, Ben? Why were you saddened? Did you not enjoy your first Christmas at Longbourn?
I might have, if not for the unpleasant thought that I might never see you again after having only just met you. I never wish to feel that way again.
Life offers no such guarantees, Ben. But you need not worry. Remember what I told you when we parted in Kent? You and I will always carry each other in our hearts. We are family as long as we live. Nothing will separate us. I have a feeling this Christmas at Pemberley will be memorable, Darcy promised.
With a house the size of Pemberley, I should imagine all our family might be well settled here. Would you like that, Dar?
Christmas is a time for family.
My sentiments exactly.
Ben climbed down from Darcy's lap. Where are you off to?
I am on a mission.
You are? Do you care to elaborate on the details?
No, it shall be a great surprise.
What about your riding lesson?
May I be excused from my lesson this morning? My mission is urgent.
Perhaps this once.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Ben poked his head inside Elizabeth's sitting room. He found her studying the household ledgers. He stood directly behind her before she became aware of his presence. Ben, what are you doing here? Is it not time for your riding lesson?
Indeed it is. However, Dar gave me permission to forego the lesson this morning. I am on a mission.
A mission, you say? Is it a secret mission, or are you at liberty to discuss the details with me?
Oh, no, I cannot say what is the purpose of my mission. You must trust me.
I see. But I imagine it must be important to make you forego your riding lesson, even for a day. You love riding.
Indeed I do. Mamma, I was just speaking with Dar about some of his favourite memories of Christmas. I was at a loss to share my own. Have I any special memories I may have forgotten?
Ben, I am sure you do. Let me see. Do you recall how your Grandfather Carlton and I would bundle you up, and the three of us would ride about the countryside bearing gifts of warm clothing to the less fortunate families in the local villages?
Truly, Mamma?
Indeed. On Christmas Eve, the three of us would deck the halls with boughs of holly and greenery. It was the one evening you were allowed to stay up longer than usual, and we would sit around the fireplace warming ourselves as the Yule log burned on the fire.
It sounds wonderful. I wish I could remember.
So do I, son. However, I imagine you were too young to maintain those memories. One can hardly blame you. But what of this past Christmas at Longbourn? Have you no memories of spending time with your grandparents? Do you remember how Aunt Mary read to everyone? Ben's greatest memory of his Aunt Mary was how she enjoyed reading Fordyce's sermons. Surely the fact that she did so on Christmas Eve warranted no special consideration on his part. His countenance said as much. Elizabeth continued recounting the events of the past Christmas. Who could forget how Aunt Kitty and Aunt Lydia made a mess of the holiday greenery, and how they argued over the best placement of the mistletoe? In addition, your young cousins from town were there. Do you not remember any of that?
I imagine my greatest recollection was feeling sad about King Arthur's leave-taking and my fear I might never see him again.
Elizabeth bit her lower lip. It could not have helped that I did not believe King Arthur truly existed. Have you forgiven me for not believing in you?
Oh, yes, Mamma. My greatest wish was that you too would meet King Arthur. I knew you would love him just as much as I. Now look at us.
Yes, you and I are truly blessed to have found King Arthur.
Indeed, wishes do come true.
The purpose of his visit came to mind.
Mamma, if you could have but one wish in this world to spend Christmas with anyone, who would it be?
Is this a trick question? My greatest wish is to spend Christmas with you, son. This, in turn, means I should also greatly wish to spend it with Fitzwilliam. A happy smile lighted her face. How lucky it is for me that you two seldom part.
Then I should say other than Dar and me.
A faraway look in Elizabeth's eyes spoke volumes. I dearly miss my sister Jane.
Aunt Jane, you say? I miss her as well. But you speak as if you might never see her again, Mamma. Why is that?
I fear the reasons for my sentiments are far too complicated for you to comprehend.
Mamma, I am growing older with each passing day. You must not think of me as a child. Dar says I am old enough to begin private tutoring lessons. In fact, my lessons commence in January.
I suppose you are correct. Do you remember Mr. Collins? The answer to her question etched across his face.
The evil... Meliagant?
Meliagant? Is that how you refer to Mr. Collins? Ben nodded.
Indeed.
But you were about to say the evil Meliagant, were you not? Is that how you imagine Mr. Collins?
In the beginning of our acquaintance, I did. I have since considered he is not evil at all.
What brought about the change in attitude?
Dar told me that I must respect him on the chance that he might become my stepfather. He said Mr. Collins was a good father, admired by Gillian and Emily, and therefore a good man.
Fitzwilliam told you that? Well, wonders never cease. To this day he has nary a good thing to say about the gentleman. Not that I blame him. With such being the case, why do you refer to Mr. Collins as a Meliagant still?
I prefer to keep my options open where he is concerned.
Ben, the reason I bring him up at all is that there is something you should know as regards Mr. Collins.
There is?
Yes, there is. Ben, your Aunt Jane and Mr. Collins are married. He is your uncle.
Oh, I am aware of that already.
Elizabeth decided not to press. She supposed Fitzwilliam must have told Ben of this. Indeed, how do you feel in having Mr. Collins as your uncle?
Better he is my uncle than my stepfather.
Next, Ben went in search of Darcy's cousin Anne, and he found her in the east parlour.
Good day, my lady.
Ben bowed before Anne, who sat in a chair next to the window overlooking Pemberley's maze garden. Good day, young sir. How was your riding lesson this morning?
I did not have a lesson this morning.
Oh, why ever not?
Dar gave me permission to forego my lesson. I am on an important mission.
Would this important mission have anything to do with the Knights of the Round Table? Are you off to wage war against your foes or rescue a fair maiden in distress? Ben tucked his hands behind his back.
Perhaps.
Do not keep me in suspense. Which is it?
I shall not say.
Then what say you? Is there a purpose to this visit?
Indeed. Dar gave me an account of his fondest memories of Christmas this morning, which causes me to wonder...
Wonder what?
You and Dar are cousins. You and the Colonel are cousins. Did you also spend Christmas in Matlock when you were a young girl?
Anne smiled. Indeed I did. But mind you, Fitzwilliam and Richard tended to avoid me like the plague when we were small children. However, after Grandfather and Grandmother Fitzwilliam passed away, family Christmases were spent at Pemberley, at least whilst Lady Anne lived.
Lady Anne?
Yes, Fitzwilliam's mother.
I never knew you were Dar's mother's namesake.
Indeed, my mother loved her sister dearly.
Do you miss Lady Anne?
Indeed, I miss her very much, especially at Christmas time. After my grandparents' passing, she made sure that Christmas at Pemberley was everything it had been at Matlock. As children, our joy knew no difference.
Did Lady Anne and your mother have much in common?
My mother?
Yes, the great lady at Camelot. I remember her well.
Anne chuckled. My mother sees to it that she is hard to forget. She is as different from Lady Anne as night is from day.
I like your mother. She asks too many questions. However, I do not mind. She speaks fondly of my grandmother Carlton.
That is correct. My mother and your grandmother were friends when they knew each other years ago. I am sorry for your loss. You have suffered much for a child so young.
Thank you, Miss Anne. Though I never met my grandmother Carlton, I am sure I would have loved her. I do miss the thought of her.
Thank God you have a mother who loves you more than anything on this earth.
And what of your mother? Do you miss her?
I suppose I do, though I am quite certain she is upset with me for choosing to live here at Pemberley rather than returning to Rosings Park.
I wager she misses you even so.
Satisfied with the fruits of his efforts thus far, the young lad headed off in search of the person whom he knew would further aid him in his quest.
There you are, Ben. I have been searching all over for you. I even spoke to Samuel to ascertain your whereabouts. He said you missed your riding lesson this morning. I am glad you found me, Aunt Georgiana. I am on a special mission. I must have a word with you.
Certainly. In fact, we might both be of use to each other.
How might I help you, my lady?
I am about to begin my afternoon practice on the pianoforte. I thought you might join me and turn the pages.
I should like that very much.
Capital. How might I assist you?
I am gathering fond Christmas memories. I have so few of my own, and with Christmas just around the corner...
Ben's voice trailed off. I am sorry to hear you have so little recollection of past Christmases. I am older than you by 12 years, and sadly enough, I can admit to having very few fond Christmas memories myself.
But Miss Anne said Lady Anne did everything in her power to make Christmas here at Pemberley special.
Georgiana sat on the settee and took Ben's hand in hers.
Ben,
I never truly knew my mother. She passed away soon after my birth. Ben's wide eyes filled with tears.
I am sorry, Aunt Georgiana.
You are very kind. She read the pain in his eyes. I'm sorry to convey such sad tidings.
Indeed, I am saddened to hear you never knew your mother. I never knew my father.
Yes, I know. We have both suffered great losses. Thank God we have people who love us, who help in keeping us strong and looking forward, rather than regretting our pasts. The two wiped each other's tears away before sharing a long embrace.
I say that is quite enough of that. What say you?
Georgiana asked. She wiped any remaining tears from her eyes, stood, and offered her hand to Ben. They resumed their walk to the music room in silence. Upon their arrival, the bright shining sun that bathed the room immediately revived their spirits.
Aunt Georgiana, about my mission.
Yes, Ben?
I need your help.
Hours later, Georgiana and Ben sat across from each other at the table.
Your scheme is most agreeable, and I shall do everything I can to help you bring it to fruition. With that said, I urge you not to expect too much. It is rather late in the year to take on such an endeavour.
Georgiana perused the list of names she and Ben had compiled.
Many of our desired guests will have already settled on their plans for Christmas by now. I should not be surprised if our relations are agreeable to changing their plans. Who would forego a chance to visit Pemberley? It is magical here.
Of course you are correct, Ben. Pemberley is indeed magical, especially now that you are here. She placed the tip of her dainty finger atop his nose. Let us embark on our letter-writing campaign. Mind you, this is an arduous undertaking. The first order of business is to recruit additional resources to carry out the tasks.
Who do you have in mind? I mean, for this to be a surprise for Mamma and Da.
Yes, I understand. Your father and mother must not know what we are about. Therefore, it is incumbent upon us to rally only those we can trust to maintain this confidence. I am thinking of Mrs. Reynolds. I am sure she can be trusted. Do you not agree?
I agree.
Then let us proceed. Part 2. Mr. Bennet paced the floor, clutching a letter in his hand. It served as further evidence of his second oldest daughter's persistence to vex him at every turn. First, she married the late Randall Carlton at 17 against his advice. Second, she failed to honour her arrangement with him by refusing to marry Geoffrey Collins, their cousin and the next in line to inherit Longbourn, owing to its entail to the male line of the family. This latest act is tantamount to a blatant slap in my face. I contend it is criminal to extend an invitation to travel to the wilds of Derbyshire with nary a hint of covering the expense. Criminal, Mr. Bennet? Whatever do you mean? While days of travel with the associated burden of food and lodging along the way may pose no challenge to a man of Mr. Darcy's means, it is hardly a trivial pursuit for someone of my circumstances. I reckon years of living at Camberwell as the mother of the precious young heir to Sarah Carlton's fortune, and now living at Pemberley as the wife of its haughty master, has caused Lizzie to forget what she is about. Mrs. Bennet by then had intimate knowledge of every word in the letter that had been dispatched to Longbourn by private carrier hours earlier. The invitation was extended by Miss Darcy as a means of surprising Lizzie and Mr. Darcy. Or surely the young lady can know nothing of such matters. He peered over his spectacles. What is your point? You are a gentleman, as is her brother. She might never consider you as being of lesser means. Mrs. Bennet determined to persist, suspecting as she did that her husband would do or say anything that might spare him the trouble of leaving the comforts of his library. As much money as she spent on gowns for her daughters, she doubted the veracity of his claims that he could not afford to travel to Derbyshire. Perhaps if I appeal directly to Lizzie and explain the situation, the entire matter might be resolved with no inconvenience to anyone. She placed her hand over her chest. Oh, how I long to see Pemberley! Oh, just think how our friends will suffer the news of our being invited there for Christmas. The elderly patriarch, who secretly wished to see his daughter's new home, feigned resignation. I suppose if you are determined to do this, there is little I might do to stop you. Mrs. Bennet's pleasure was just what might be expected of a proud mamma who often boasted of her second eldest daughter's excellent match to a gentleman who was rumoured to own half of Derbyshire. Once she had delighted in her first tumult of joy at her husband's expense, she set off to tell the rest of her family the glad news. What a difference a year makes, Jane considered as she lay in bed, her head resting comfortably on her husband's broad chest. Even with her good fortune in marrying a man she revered, sad thoughts of Charles Bingley's precipitous departure from Hertfordshire weighed heavily on her mind whenever she allowed herself to consider it. She sighed. Geoffrey Collins swept his fingers through his wife's loosened hair. "You are awake?" "I am afraid so. Forgive me for disturbing your slumber." "Think nothing of it." Jane lifted her head. "There is a reason for my inability to sleep." "No doubt." "Do you not wish to know what that reason is?" "You are determined to tell me. Now that I am wide awake, I am obliged to listen." "We received an invitation to spend Christmas at Pemberley this year." He spoke not a word. "Have you nothing to say?" "What would you have me to say?" Collins asked. "I always supposed it was only a matter of time before the Darcys deigned to invite us to their estimable abode, my dear wife. I imagine your sister cannot wait to flaunt her good fortune." "My dear, I wish you would not think as harshly of Lizzie as you do." He silently considered that he might never truly forgive Elizabeth for choosing Fitzwilliam Darcy, thereby rendering himself a jilted lover. Heaven knows he had tried. Perhaps in time he would excuse her scandalous behaviour. He had observed how Darcy had pursued her with little regard for her standing as his intended. Fitzwilliam Darcy was the villain. Elizabeth was simply the dupe. "Geoffrey, have you heard one word I have spoken?" "I am sorry." "I am certain no ill intent exists as far as this invitation is concerned. Miss Darcy extends this request. She and my nephew are planning a grand surprise for my sister and brother. Miss Darcy writes to say that she is especially looking forward to making Gillian and Emily's acquaintance. She says that my nephew speaks fondly of the girls." "I rather doubt that. The little devil went out of his way to torment the girls." "I believe you are far too harsh on poor Ben. Gillian and Emily speak fondly of their exploits whilst in Hunsford. I assure you, they gave as well as they took." "I suppose you have a point." "Does that mean you are agreeable to spending Christmas at Pemberley?" "If that is your wish, I am obliged to say yes." "I should like it very much. I shall write a letter to my sister straight away letting her know of our intentions." Collins refused to surrender his wife from his embrace. "I believe the letter can wait, my dear wife." He graced her lips with a tender kiss and guided her astride his person. "Need I remind you that you have my full attention?" Mr. William Collins nearly tripped over his feet as he raced up the steps to the hall. He paused long enough to encourage his wife Charlotte to make haste. He took her by the hand and pulled her through the antechamber to the room where his patroness was sitting. "Mr. Collins, Mrs. Collins, what is the meaning of this delay? Did I not make my carriage available to deliver you here? Why was I forced to endure such a wait?" "Good morning, your ladyship. Pardon our tardiness." There is nothing to be done now. However, I will be most displeased should it happen again. Yes, Lady Catherine. You two can have no doubt of the reason for my summons. My niece informs me that she has invited the two of you to join our family at Pemberley for Christmas. Heaven only knows what she was thinking, what with Mr. Collins's obligation to look out for the less fortunate and the poor amongst us, especially at Christmas time, to assist where he might. Alas, it cannot be helped, for I have decided that we shall travel to Derbyshire together, the three of us. You are most kind, your ladyship. Indeed, you need not suffer any misgivings for your inability to tend to your duties. I shall take it upon myself to find a visiting parson to act in your stead. I shall be forever in your debt, your ladyship. Fate is on your side, Richard. You will have yet another chance to secure Anne's hand in marriage, what with all of us being invited to spend Christmas at Pemberley this year. Lord Matlock handed the snifter filled with his finest brandy to his youngest son. He took his own glass to the table and set it down. I know not which is harder to believe, that Darcy would invite you to spend Christmas with his family, or that you might actually accept, said Colonel Fitzwilliam. I will have you know, son, that I value Christmas as much as anyone else. I beg your pardon? Since when did you value Christmas, my lord? I know of no one who values it less. Was it not you who pronounced Christmas to be nothing more than an excuse for excessive idleness and nonsensical frivolity? Rubbish! I have always honoured Christmas, as you have well known. Of course. That explains why we have not gathered here as a family since my grandparents passed away. A hint of concern graced Lord Matlock's countenance. He took a seat and reached for his pipe. I never knew you felt this strongly, son. What do you expect me to say? Perhaps if you had bothered to ask, you would have known. There is nothing to be done. Thanks to Georgiana and young Ben, we have all been invited to spend Christmas together at Pemberley, as a family. Capital! Lord Matlock lit his pipe and took a long draw. Back to the matter at hand. What are your plans as regards Anne? I understand you were quite instrumental in helping her recover from the loss of your cousin's affections to his recent bride. I have considered that you might parlay your newfound friendship into something more. Need I remind you that, as a second son, Anne would be quite a catch? You need not continue to remind me, my lord. I am well aware of my need to win the hand of a wealthy woman if I am to continue to live in the style I am accustomed to. Indeed. Anne will make a decent wife. I'm convinced of it. You know how fond I am of my niece. Be that as it may, your opinion of Anne is of little concern to me. I shall not choose my bride on the basis of your recommendation. We shall see about that, son. Colonel Fitzwilliam's mother, Lady Ellen, walked into the room. We shall see about what, my lord? Richard huffed. Come now, mother. You can hardly suffer any doubt over what my father is discussing, for it seems he has no greater ambition of late than to see me settled with Anne. A father wants what is best for his son, said his lordship. Lady Ellen looked at her husband with dismay. For the sake of familial harmony, I do wish you would give your matchmaking attempts a rest, my lord. Shall we all agree to do or say nothing that will take away from the joyousness of spending Christmas together at Pemberley once again after so many years? She placed her hand on her husband's. What a happy time this will be for all. Part 3. Elizabeth had supposed she had enough to contend with as regarded being the new mistress of Pemberley and her added duties toward its tenants during the Christmas season. Now her responsibilities were more than doubled. When her husband walked into the room, she said, You will never guess what your sister and my son have been up to. You are correct, my love. Perhaps you should tell me what your sister and my son have done. She smiled at his gentle chastisement. Of course, he had stated it aptly. Georgiana and she were as close as two sisters might ever wish to be, and Darcy could not have loved Ben more if he were his own flesh and blood. They were indeed a very happy family. Where do I begin? It turns out that Georgiana and Ben have conspired to invite most of our relations to spend Christmas with us at Pemberley. Darcy's countenance belied his intention to feign a lack of knowledge. "You do not look surprised," said Elizabeth. He shrugged. "I confess to have gotten wind of their scheme soon after it had begun. Both Mrs. Reynolds and my steward were obliged to break their confidences." "Your steward was made aware of this scheme before me?" "I am afraid so, my love. Georgiana and Ben intended it as a surprise, for both of us." "You obviously have not spoken with either of them on this matter, Mr. Darcy. I, on the other hand, was obliged to get to the bottom of this, pursuant to the receipts of several letters today." "I pray you are not too upset with them, my love. I am sure they meant no harm." "I declare the two of them have you completely in their power. Is there anything that either Georgiana or Ben might do that might meet with your disapproval?" "May I have a moment to ponder your question?" "By all means. Take as much time as you need, whilst I consider how to accommodate this unexpected influx of guests for what might be weeks, if they arrive at all. Have you not warned me that Derbyshire winters can be quite harsh?" "Do not fret, my love. Mrs. Reynolds, with my blessing, has been preparing for the possibility of receiving a large party of guests for a while." "It seems you have thought of everything, then." Darcy made every effort to prevent the escape of the chuckle that threatened to bubble forth. "Not everything. While I am privy to the list of invitees, I am quite ignorant as regards their acceptance." Elizabeth gathered the letters she had received and brought them to the sitting-room couch where Darcy sat. "Here, see for yourself." Darcy accepted the first proffered letter. After a moment he said, "I should not be surprised to find that Lord and Lady Matlock have accepted. In light of his miserable attempt to force a marriage between Anne and me, no doubt my uncle is eager to play matchmaker between Richard and Anne." "That sounds of bitterness, my love. I thought you and your uncle had put your differences behind you. After all, it was very generous of him to remain at Pemberley with Georgiana, Ben and Anne whilst we were on our wedding journey." "Yes, but that has little to do with me, I assure you. It has everything to do with his desire to control Anne's fate, and thus her fortune." "I wish you would endeavour to see your uncle in a more favourable light. After all, your cousin Richard is a second son. He could do worse than marry Anne." "Please, do not start parroting Lord Matlock. Besides, I thought you enjoyed having Anne live here with us." "Indeed I do. However, we must allow that this arrangement will not last forever. If not Richard, then surely she will find happiness with another man. You must want that for your cousin." Darcy kissed Elizabeth on her temple. "You are correct, my love. And do not fear. I shall do everything in my power to remain cordial with my uncle." Darcy reached for the stack of letters. "Who else has responded?" This is a letter from Mamma. I am afraid you will be vexed by what she has to say." "Perhaps not. What does she say? Are we to receive your parents and your sisters for Christmas?" "That depends. Are you prepared to cover the entire expense of their conveyance to Derbyshire?" Elizabeth immediately felt a flush of colour rising in her cheeks, having voiced her mother's outrageous request aloud. Darcy's opinion of her family had been low enough upon meeting them in Hertfordshire the year before. Hitherto, she imagined his estimation of her family could not possibly sink any lower. Darcy must have read embarrassment in Elizabeth's face. He took her by the hand. "If needs be, my love. Why do you ask?" Elizabeth handed him the letter and pointed to her mother's uncouth sentiments. After reading it, he reached over, cupped her chin, and looked into her eyes. "Consider it done, my love." Elizabeth moved to sit on her husband's lap. One by one, the pages of her letters fell to the floor as she expressed her deep love and affection for him. "What was that about?" he asked a quarter-hour later. "Am I not allowed to show you how much I love you, however and whenever I choose, my love?" "You will hear no objections from me." "I received several other letters today." "From the Gardiners, the Collinses, both Collinses, and Lady Catherine, correct?" "Indeed. My uncle and aunt Gardiner send their regrets. I am afraid business concerns prevent their travelling so far from London on such short notice." "I am sorry to hear it. I have yet to spend any time at all in making their acquaintance. Perhaps we should invite them to visit us during the summer." "I should like that." "What of the Collinses? Will they be in attendance?" "Which Collinses do you speak of?" "Does it matter?" Darcy considered one of the brothers Collins was just as bad as the other. What the one possessed in ridiculousness and sycophancy, the other possessed in haughtiness and arrogance. Elizabeth suffered little doubt as to where her husband's thoughts tended, knowing what she did of how little he abided both men. "Fitzwilliam, what manner of family holiday are we to expect if you barely tolerate Mr. Collins?" "Which Mr. Collins?" Darcy mocked. "You decide. Besides, I suspect you will bear the elder Mr. Collins far better than you did during your time in Kent. Ben told me about your selfless advice to him to honour and respect Mr. Collins, even when you thought that he and I might wed." "I am afraid you are crediting me with far better intentions than I possessed. I knew you would never go through with that marriage." "You did, sir? How did you suppose that?" "I realized that you were mine from the moment our lips met." "You are very confident, are you not?" He smiled at this description of himself. "Well, there is that. There is also the fact that I am nothing if not patient, my love." In 1 week, the guest list was known to all, and the arrival dates of all were fixed. Elizabeth had given in to Ben and Georgiana's request to decorate the halls of Pemberley with fresh greenery and sprigs of holly sooner rather than later, all superstitions about engaging in such activities before Christmas Eve aside. Nothing proved more entertaining to young Ben than witnessing his father honour his mamma under the mistletoe. The fact that Ben and Georgiana had seen fit to adorn every room with a leafy green plant with waxy white berries gave them the occasion to witness the spectacle with alacrity. As they did most evenings, Darcy, Elizabeth and Anne sat around the fireplace, whilst Georgiana exhibited on the pianoforte, with Ben seated next to her, turning the pages at her subtle cues. Being the grown-ups in the room, it was incumbent upon Darcy, Elizabeth and Anne to consider with great determination what the upcoming weeks might bring, to imagine every conversation they might have with estranged relatives, and to calm their anxieties and fears with what they concocted as the perfect discourse to every possible encounter. Anne welcomed the news of the imminent arrival of her mother with a mixture of trepidation and uncertainty. She and Lady Catherine had barely corresponded during the week since Anne decided to make Pemberley her home. For once in her life, she enjoyed a sense of belonging. Was the peace of mind and sense of worthiness she now enjoyed about to be snatched away, stolen by her mother should she demand that Anne return to Rosings Park to live with her? She took some comfort in the notion that Richard planned to join them for Christmas. He would protect her from her mother, should it come to that. It vexed Anne that her uncle might persist in his scheme to force her into a marriage with Richard. The last thing she wanted was a marriage of convenience, especially after bearing witness to the joys of a true love match, as evidenced by her cousin Fitzwilliam and Elizabeth. That being said, should the genial feelings she and Richard shared grow into something more, she surely would not object. Elizabeth sat in a chair beside her husband on the opposite side of the fireplace from Anne. Joy and contentment shone on both their faces. From time to time, either would reach across and touch the other. Any excuse would do. They liked touching each other. Anne endeavoured to suppress the smile that threatened to grace her countenance. She wondered if the two of them were even aware of how often they behaved thus. From across the room, Georgiana looked up in time to answer her cousin's unspoken question with a knowing smile. Everyone's fondest wish was that any misunderstandings the two ladies had suffered through the years, owing to Anne's futile pursuit of Darcy, had been forgotten. Elizabeth admired her son from across the room. "He is growing up so fast. The private tutor Fitzwilliam hired is but the first step. Before I know it, he will be off to boarding school." Seeing him beside Georgiana, patiently attending her as she performed, Elizabeth could not help thinking of Ben's late father, Randall Carlton. Tears pooled in her eyes. She never truly had known the happiness she now felt. She never truly had loved anyone as she loved Darcy, and she never had felt as loved as she did in that moment. Much had happened since she was a young maiden of 17, marrying against her father's advice. Yet she did not regret a moment of her past. To have altered a single course in the path that she had chosen thus far meant that she might not have been blessed with the gift of her beloved son. Where would I be without Ben? What would I be without Ben? Elizabeth subconsciously touched her belly. If what she suspected was true, Ben might soon have a sibling. Always in tune with his wife, Darcy made note of her gesture. "Elizabeth often does that," he silently conjectured. Leaning forward, he whispered softly, "Is there anything you wish to confide in me, my love?" Elizabeth raised a silencing finger to her lips. The two lovers shared a knowing smile. Tick-tock, tick-tock. As much as Darcy enjoyed such moments with his family, try as he might, he could not help glancing toward the clock atop the mantel, and wondering why it loomed louder than the lovely sounds emanating from the pianoforte. The end of Georgiana's rendition of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata coincided with the musical carillons of the clock. "Bravo, dearest Georgiana!" He stood and stretched his legs, sauntered towards the instrument, and extended his hand to Ben. "It is time for bed." Elizabeth set aside her sewing and crossed the room to join her husband. "Georgiana and Anne, if the two of you will pardon me, I believe I shall retire for the evening as well." If Elizabeth's leave-taking came as a surprise to either Georgiana or Anne, they did not intend for her to know. Moments later found Ben tucked in his bed, recanting a familiar refrain for that time of the evening.
"Why can I not stay up a while longer, Dar?"
"Ben, are we to have this conversation every night? Your bedtime is fixed, and no amount of conversation on your part will persuade me otherwise." Darcy was adamant in that regard. It had taken far longer than he would have thought for Ben to fall asleep in his own bed and remain there throughout the night without waking and joining him and Elizabeth in the master's suite. What was a man violently in love with his bride to do?
"But what about Christmas Eve? You promised I might stay up past my bedtime on Christmas Eve."
"Yes, your mother and I conceded to your request to allow you to remain awake an hour past your bedtime, as part of our family's new Christmas tradition." Ben yawned. Darcy and Elizabeth knew sleep would find him within seconds of their blowing out the bedside candle. His voice trailed slowly along the path toward slumber.
"This will be the happiest Christmas ever."
Elizabeth and Darcy considered Ben's words, and both silently reaffirmed their resolve to allow for the joy the upcoming family gathering might bring. For Elizabeth, it offered second chances for healing with her dearest sister and her father. For Darcy, it promised a time for celebrating his love for his new family, rejoicing and creating memories and establishing traditions. Darcy and Elizabeth's sentiments sang out in harmony as both leaned forward and bestowed a light kiss on either side of Ben's face. Elizabeth lingered a bit longer. "Indeed, my son, This shall be the greatest Christmas ever. Part 4. By the dawn of Christmas Eve, all the Bennet and Fitzwilliam guests who had planned to be at Pemberley had arrived and settled into their routines. Thankfully, the roads had favoured the guests throughout their journeys, and all had been welcomed in their turn, several bearing a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, purpose and hope. Ben's elation shone on his face, and nothing anyone might say or do stood a chance of altering it. He never recalled seeing so many people he knew and called family in one place at the same time. Even the spectacle of Gillian and Emily in awe of his Aunt Georgiana and their want of joining them for her afternoon practice did not bother him as much as it might have, had he not managed to find other means of enjoying her sole company. Ben raced to Georgiana's door and tapped lightly. Upon his entering the room, she smiled and said,
"Good morning, Ben. Have you come to escort me to the music room?" "Indeed. I suppose the girls will be there upon our arrival. I wish to have a few words with you whilst I have a chance." "Ben, are you not happy to have Gillian and Emily at Pemberley? They are delightful." "I am satisfied to have all our family here. That is what I want to discuss with you."
Georgiana offered her hand to Ben, and the two headed towards the music room.
"What would you like to discuss?" "I simply wanted to thank you again for helping to make our grand family holiday possible. This is the best Christmas ever."
"I assure you it was no trouble on my part." She was correct. Whilst she and Ben had planned the scheme, Mrs. Reynolds, along with Darcy and his steward, had carried it through.
"Still, I am happy to know you are pleased. I confess to being exceedingly happy as well. I wish every Christmas will find us surrounded by family and friends." "I could not agree more. I can hardly wait for this evening's merriment,"
said Ben. "Nor I, to be sure," said Georgiana. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was equally delighted with the prospects the occasion afforded. In spite of the cold air nipping at their noses, Elizabeth and Jane enjoyed a brisk stroll about the garden, and admired nature's wondrous adornment of the shrubbery and trees. Jane said, "What a beautiful home this is! It is almost magical, and I do not recall ever seeing you this happy. It is such a pleasure to have you here, dearest Jane. Thank you for inviting us. I must confess the invitation came as quite a surprise. Actually, we have Ben to thank for the pleasure of receiving everyone at Pemberley for Christmas. My little nephew has always had a tender heart." Elizabeth's gaze drifted toward the direction in which the men had set off a half-hour earlier in pursuit of the Christmas Yule log. Whilst Darcy had meant for the excursion to serve as a basis for a tradition amongst Ben, Richard, and himself, Ben wanted both his grandfather and his great-uncle, the Earl of Matlock, to accompany them as well. Before long, by Lady Catherine's contrivances, the party included both of the Mr. Collinses. Mr. Bennet, however, being satisfied to spend every moment since his arrival accustoming himself to Pemberley's library, made some excuse about the folly of someone his age attempting such a feat. Hearing of this, his wife was inclined to agree. Thus he had remained by the comfortable fire with a promise to read to Ben upon his return, hence starting their own tradition. She smiled wistfully. "It is most unfortunate not everyone in our party shares your sentiments. I take it you are referring to Geoffrey and young Ben's history." Elizabeth had made no secret of her disapproval of Jane's marrying Mr. Collins. She had apologized by way of a letter, but this was her first time in company with Jane since the wedding. In turn, Jane had written to her dearest sister and had insisted there were no harsh feelings. Both of them had made the best choices for their situation. Were she to do it all again, Jane would not change a thing if that is what it took to lead her to the happiness she now enjoyed with Geoffrey Collins, for he was the best man she ever knew, an excellent father, a good provider, and a loving husband. Indeed, he was everything a gentleman ought to be. Jane said,
"Dearest Lizzie, some things are best forgotten. Do you not agree?"
"Jane, if I am to be completely honest, I would say that I shall never forget the acrimony that marked my departure from Kent."
"I confess that Geoffrey has alluded to lingering feelings of discord in that regard as well. I know none of the particulars. I consider it a private matter between the two of you. However, it is water under the bridge."
Jane looked at her sister intently.
"I am only asking that you show Geoffrey the same manner of charity that I would show my brother Fitzwilliam, were he ever to do anything to affect my felicity. Shall I lock the two of you in a room until both of you agree to get along as a brother and sister ought?"
Elizabeth laughed at the notion of having to endure such a sentence. "Oh, heaven forbid, dearest Jane. I dare say it need never come to that. In such case as this, I simply must rely even heavier upon my philosophy to think only of the past, as its remembrance gives me pleasure." Snow blanketed the grounds on Christmas Day. With the exception of Lord Matlock, everyone was so delighted in being at Pemberley that the possibility of extending their stay pursuant to a heavy snowstorm found its way into many of their silent prayers at church. The brilliant gleam of the sun reflecting off the snow-covered ground upon their return to the manor persuaded some of the members of the party to consider praying a bit harder. Soon it would be time for dinner. The formal dining room, as well as the smaller one, gaily boasted lavish decorations of greenery and red berries on the mantels and tables, as well as in the doorways. A misfortunate event concerning Elizabeth and her cousin William Collins had precipitated the mysterious disappearance of the theretofore strategically placed mistletoe about the manor. Georgiana had made it a habit of enjoying her meals in the smaller dining room with Gillian, Emily, and Ben of late. Elizabeth had suggested that her younger sisters might do the same. Unfortunately, Kitty and Lydia were of a different opinion, and neither hesitated to voice it with alacrity. Whilst preparing for dinner, Lydia made her sentiments known once more. "Georgiana may very well eat with children should she desire. I certainly shall not." "Oh, of course not, my dear," cried Mrs. Bennet. "How on earth are you to garner the attention of Colonel Fitzwilliam amidst the distraction of children? Oh, besides, you are nearly 6 and 10. Kitty is 7 and 10. What was Lizzie thinking in suggesting such a thing? Oh, she has no compassion for my nerves." Mrs. Bennet suffered an added note of vexation when Mary entered the room. "Mary, how on earth do you expect to catch a husband in such a gown?" Confusion graced the younger woman's countenance.
"Husband? Mamma, I assure you that I am not expecting to catch a husband."
"March back to your room this instant and put on the gown I had the maid lay out for you. One might only guess what type of woman might capture the Colonel's fancy. After all, who would have thought that Mr. Darcy would prefer Lizzie? All you girls must be displayed to your greatest advantage." Hours later, Lady Catherine was astounded by the diverse guests assembled around her beloved late sister's table. "It is woefully plain to see that Mrs. Elizabeth Darcy is in over her head. How dare she place her ghastly mother next to me, the daughter of a tradesman, seated next to the daughter of an earl?" Lady Catherine huffed. "Oh, clearly, Elizabeth knows nothing of protocol and etiquette. At least Mrs. Bennet has the good sense not to try to engage me in any sort of discourse." Her ladyship observed Charlotte politely nodding in response to her husband's nonsensical observation on the elegant table setting. "Mrs. Collins seated next to her husband," her ladyship silently protested. "Elizabeth's sister Jane seated next to her husband, Geoffrey Collins. Do my eyes deceive me, or are those two holding hands underneath the table? If her smiles are any indication, heaven knows what else is taking place beyond my view." Her sardonic musings were interrupted when Darcy fulfilled his role as host in expressing his gladness at being surrounded by family members, both old and new, and then offered a toast to his wife. Lord Matlock, in his highly prized role as head of the family, proposed the next toast.
Mrs. Darcy, pardon me, my dear Elizabeth, it has been my honour and my great pleasure to welcome you and your son into our family. We are blessed and happy indeed to receive the rest of your family as well. Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, Mr. and Mrs. Geoffrey Collins, Mr. and Mrs. William Collins, Miss Bennet.
Oh, how Lady Catherine wished her loquacious brother would hasten to a conclusion. She fought to refrain from rolling her eyes.
Miss Catherine and Miss Lydia, I welcome you, one and all, to our family.
The silly girls were beside themselves with glee, having been singled out by the aristocrat, as their unrestrained giggles attested. Just as her ladyship was about to utter a silent prayer of thanks for the unexpected brevity of her brother's speech, Lord Matlock raised his glass again.
At the risk of speaking out of turn, I propose a toast to the increasing regard between my son Richard and my dearly loved niece Anne.
Lady Catherine gasped aloud. Surely her brother was getting ahead of himself. What is he about? Could he be any more blatant in attempting to force an alliance between Colonel Fitzwilliam and my Anne? She had not failed to notice the two sat next to each other. Is Darcy's wife in on my brother's scheme? Her ladyship had to admit that Anne never looked happier. A few moments of observation persuaded her there might be some merit in the scheme after all. My Anne could do far worse than marrying my nephew. His being a second son guarantees that the two of them will reside at Rosings Park. I believe I should like having my nephew as a son-in-law. Katy and Lydia's unseemly behaviour intruded upon Lady Catherine's new-found pleasure, and caused her to wonder at their even being at the dinner table. The younger one's out with an older sister unmarried. Heaven and earth! I have never witnessed so much cleavage on display in my life. How does one support all of that weight with a mere corset? My Anne had better stake her claim on her cousin quickly with these wild Bennet girls roaming the halls. Darcy and Elizabeth tucked Ben in bed earlier that evening, amidst his protests of wanting to remain in company beyond his bedtime, as he had done on Christmas Eve. Promises that Christmases to come would offer as much or more joyousness as this one, and that soon enough he would be allowed to remain awake longer, accompanied by an entertaining Christmas tale, sufficed to send the young man to dreamland with merry hopes for the future dancing in his head. With Ben tucked in bed, Darcy and Elizabeth were at liberty to give their guests their undivided attention for the rest of the evening. After hours of lively entertainment and gaiety inherent in the season amongst the family, Darcy and Elizabeth now sat upon the sitting-room sofa, basking in calm serenity. Finally, it was their time. You seem surprised by your father's invitation for us to visit Longbourn next year. Indeed, especially in light of his dictate that I was never to grace the halls of his home again after spurning Mr. Collins's hand in marriage. I believe he would do anything to take back those words. He and I spoke at length after dining this evening, once you ladies had departed the room. He expressed his unequivocal support of our marriage. Have you not spent much time with him since his arrival? Did he not convey his good wishes and support? I confess to enjoying my papa's company during those times when there was no possibility for such talk. Well, I must see what I can do about that. Especially in light of how you manage it so I'm forced to spend significant time with Geoffrey Collins. Be careful, Mr. Darcy. I contend that I might manage the company of less than agreeable guests with far greater tolerance than you. Perhaps. Of course, I have yet to see you and your brother engaged in meaningful discourse. I am guilty as charged. It will take some time, I imagine, before I am able to cast aside his cruelty and the bitterness of our acquaintance in Hunsford. With that said, I have witnessed no such harshness on his part towards Jane. I judged her intentions poorly when she agreed to accept his hand in marriage. She cares for him deeply. She confided as much to me, which is surprising, for Jane rarely shares her true feelings with anyone.
I will endeavour not to say, "I told you so."
You are too kind, Mr. Darcy.
Speaking of kindness, my lovely wife, you were very clever in arranging things so I was compelled to spend the greater part of this evening with Collins and his brother.
Surely you did not expect to partner with Charlotte, Jane, and me. Besides, I had a far greater purpose in pitting wives against husbands than merely vexing you, my love.
What other purpose might you have had?
My reasoning is simple. I merely wanted to prove that we women are far more intelligent than you men.
In this case, what you refer to as intelligence, I liken to cheating.
Is it my fault that Charlotte, Jane, and I have been partnering in charades for years?
You have made my point exactly, my love.
You must not be too upset with me. My brother and you make a formidable team, in spite of my cousin's ineptness. I say you two have the makings of a strong and lasting friendship.
Darcy's furrowed brow suggested otherwise. Tell me again, how many days remain until the Collinses take their leave of Pemberley?
Elizabeth shook her head and walked over to their bed. She climbed inside and arranged the covers about her waist. Richard and Anne were pleasantly engaged throughout dinner, as well as in the drawing-room.
Indeed.
Is that all you have to say?
What would you have me say?
Has Richard confided in you how he feels about Anne?
He does not have to. She has the single most important quality he seeks in a woman.
Are you speaking of her dowry?
Yes, that and Rosings Park to boot. He could do far worse than marrying Anne,
Darcy said, having disrobed and joined her in bed. Now who is parroting Lord Matlock? Elizabeth placed her hand on Darcy's midsection. I wonder which other of your uncle's traits you might embrace.
Darcy was aghast. The years had not been pleasant to Lord Matlock's waistline. "Heaven forbid," said he. "Whilst we are on the subject, I might remind you of my unanswered question as regards a far more enticing stomach. Have you anything to confide in me?"
My love, is it fair to confide in you that which is mere supposition on my part?
I shall let you have your secrets, for now, although I would wish to confide in you that nothing would please me more than—
With a cautioning smile, Elizabeth placed a silencing finger to his lips. Not that she suffered a superstitious nature. Far from it, as her willingness to go along with Ben and Georgiana's scheme to decorate the halls of Pemberley days before Christmas Eve evidenced. In such matters regarding the possibility of their family increasing in the coming months, she preferred to guard her hopes until the evidence presented itself with certainty. The only thing I am prepared to confess this evening is my overwhelming happiness. Though I did not immediately relish the prospect of sharing our first Christmas at Pemberley amongst estranged and conflicted family members, I am very pleased that Georgiana and Ben saw fit to arrange it all as a surprise.
Indeed, God willing, we shall enjoy Christmas amongst family every year for the rest of our lives.
I am persuaded that nothing will make Ben happier. I believe he is happiest when he is surrounded by a great number of family and friends. A light tap at the door caused Darcy and Elizabeth to look at each other knowingly. They repeated what had by now become a well-rehearsed routine, even if it had been weeks since last exercised. Darcy opened the door and spoke not a word. He lifted Ben in his arms, carried him to the bed, and placed him beside his mother. Darcy and Elizabeth blew out the candles on either side of the bed.
"Good night, Ben."
He placed a light kiss atop the child's head.
"Good night, my love." Darcy bestowed a gentle brush of his lips against Elizabeth's cheek. "Merry Christmas."
A faint, drowsy whisper echoed,
"Merry Christmas."
This has been The Mission, He Taught Me to Hope, Christmas Vignette, Darcy and the Young Knight's Quest, Book 2, written by P.O. Dixon, narrated by Pearl Hewitt. Copyright 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015 by P.O. Dixon. Production copyright 2015 by P.O. Dixon.